Have you ever wondered how ancient wisdom about balance, work, and community could transform your entire approach to modern life? Saint Benedict of Nursia, born in 480 AD in the hills of Italy, didn't just create a monastery. He developed a complete philosophy of living that shaped Western civilization for over 1,500 years. His insights about finding meaning through rhythm, building sustainable communities, and balancing contemplation with action remain as relevant today as they were in the 6th century. Tonight, we're going to explore the entire philosophy of this remarkable thinker, whose ideas about moderation, stability, and the spiritual dimensions of everyday work continue to offer profound answers to our modern struggles with burnout, disconnection, and the search for purpose. Get comfortable wherever you are right now. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension of the day begin to melt away. If you're enjoying these explorations, I'd truly appreciate a quick like or maybe a subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. I'm always curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop a comment with your city and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community connect through these quiet philosophical journeys. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why Benedict's philosophy of ora et labora, prayer and work, offers such a compelling alternative to our culture of constant hustle and exhausted collapse. The foundations: fleeing Rome and finding purpose. Benedict's philosophy didn't emerge from abstract theorizing in some ivory tower. It grew from a profound personal crisis and a radical decision that would change the course of his life. Born into privilege and comfort in the small town of Nursia in 480 AD, Benedict was part of a noble Roman family that had survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire just 4 years earlier. His world was one of tremendous upheaval and uncertainty. The old order was dying, and no one quite knew what would replace it. Benedict had a twin sister, Scholastica, and from their earliest years, the two shared an unusual spiritual bond. While other children played at being soldiers or merchants, Benedict and Scholastica would create little altars in the garden, imitating the religious services they'd witnessed. Their parents, devout Christians living in increasingly chaotic times, must have recognized something special in these children, something that set them apart from their peers. As a teenager, Benedict was sent to Rome to receive the finest education the ancient world could still offer. His parents had hopes for him. Perhaps he'd enter imperial service or become a great lawyer or administrator. The family's fortunes could be restored through his success. So Benedict arrived in the Eternal City with his old nursemaid, the woman who'd cared for him since infancy, ready to take his place among the educated elite. But what he found there horrified him. The Eternal City, once the pinnacle of civilization, had descended into moral chaos following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The great institutions were crumbling. The aqueducts were falling into disrepair. Barbarian tribes had sacked the city within living memory, and the psychological trauma of that event still haunted the population. Everywhere Benedict looked, he saw corruption masquerading as sophistication. His fellow students, the future leaders of society, spent their nights in taverns and brothels, mocking the very values they'd been raised to uphold. The theaters showcased increasingly debased spectacles that would have shocked earlier generations. Gambling houses multiplied, and perhaps most disturbing to the young Benedict, Everyone seemed to accept this as normal, as simply the way things were. There was a collective shrug, a sense that since the old order had collapsed, nothing really mattered anymore. Pleasure and power were the only values left. This wasn't just youthful disappointment or naive idealism on Benedict's part. He recognized something philosophically profound, that a society that's lost its sense of purpose, that no longer knows what it's living for beyond momentary pleasure and immediate gratification, inevitably spirals into chaos and despair. The external collapse of Roman political order was merely reflecting an internal collapse of meaning and values. The barbarians hadn't really destroyed Rome. Rome had destroyed itself from within through moral corruption and the loss of any shared understanding of what made life worth living. Benedict spent months wrestling with what he saw. He tried to maintain his studies, tried to focus on literature and rhetoric and all the traditional subjects. But increasingly, he found himself drawn to the catacombs, those underground burial chambers where early Christians had hidden during persecution, where martyrs were buried, where the walls were covered with primitive but powerful paintings of Christ and the saints. In those silent spaces, surrounded by the witness of those who'd given everything for something they believed in, Benedict felt a stark contrast to the meaningless hedonism of the streets above. So Benedict made a choice that would define everything that followed. At just 15 years old, he walked away from Rome, from his studies, from the comfortable future his family had planned for him. He headed into the mountains, seeking something his culture had forgotten how to provide, a framework for living that made sense, that offered genuine purpose, that aligned outward actions with inward convictions. His faithful nursemaid accompanied him, unable to let her young charge venture into the wilderness alone. They made their way to a small village called Enfide, about 30 miles east of Rome, where charitable Christians took them in. It was there that the first miracle associated with Benedict occurred, a small thing, really, but significant. His nursemaid had borrowed a wheat sieve from the neighbors and accidentally broke it. She wept inconsolably, devastated by this failure. Benedict, moved by compassion for the woman who'd cared for him all his life, took the broken pieces, prayed over them, and returned the sieve completely whole. Word of this miracle spread quickly through the village, and suddenly people were treating Benedict as a holy man, coming to him for prayers and blessings. But this was exactly what he didn't want. He wasn't seeking acclaim or followers. He was seeking solitude to understand himself, to understand God, to figure out what a meaningful life might look like when the entire civilization around you was falling apart. So he left his nursemaid behind, gently, with love, but firmly, and continued alone into the mountains. There, Providence arranged for him to meet a monk named Romanus, who took one look at this intense young man and understood what he was seeking. Romanus gave Benedict the monastic habit, the simple robe that marked him as someone who'd left the world behind, and showed him a cave, almost inaccessible, carved into a cliff face overlooking a lake. This would be Benedict's home for the next 3 years. This wasn't escapism, though it might have looked that way to observers. Benedict wasn't running from responsibility. He was seeking the clarity necessary to eventually take on far greater responsibilities than he would have had as just another Roman bureaucrat. His retreat into solitude was philosophical preparation, a necessary withdrawal to understand fundamental questions before returning to help others find their own answers. Sometimes You have to step completely outside a system before you can see it clearly, before you can understand what's broken and imagine what might replace it. The cave years, solitude as philosophical laboratory. For 3 years, Benedict lived alone in that cave overlooking Lake Subiaco. The monk Romanus brought him bread every few days, lowering it down the cliff face with a rope, announcing his arrival with a little bell attached to the basket. Otherwise, Benedict lived in almost complete isolation. No books except what he'd memorized from Scripture. No conversations, no distractions. Just himself, the cave walls, the changing seasons reflected in the lake below, and the vast questions about human existence that he'd carried with him from Rome. The cave itself was barely more than a cleft in the rock, damp, dark, cold in winter, and stifling in summer. Benedict had no bed, just the stone floor. No furniture, no comforts of any kind. He wore the same simple robe day after day. His diet consisted of the bread Romanus provided and whatever water he could collect from rain or from moisture seeping through the cave walls. By any conventional measure, this was a miserable existence. And yet, something profound was happening in that isolation. This period was crucial for Benedict's philosophical development. In solitude, he wasn't just praying or doing penance in the medieval sense. He was conducting a rigorous philosophical experiment with the most important laboratory subject available: his own consciousness, his own patterns of thought and desire, his own capacity for meaning-making. He was testing himself, pushing himself to the limits of what he could endure, learning what was essential and what was merely habitual or cultural conditioning. What Benedict discovered in that cave would form the bedrock of his entire philosophical system. First, and most fundamentally, he learned that human beings aren't infinitely malleable, that we have a nature with specific needs and limits. This might seem obvious, but it went against much of the extreme ascetic thinking of his time, which assumed that the body was essentially an enemy to be conquered, that physical needs were weaknesses to be suppressed as completely as possible. Benedict discovered through direct experience that this approach didn't work. Yes, you could push yourself to extremes, surviving on almost no food, almost no sleep, in conditions of extreme discomfort. But eventually, the body would rebel. You'd become sick, or your mind would start to fragment, or you'd swing wildly between extreme discipline and extreme indulgence. What Benedict learned was that sustainable spiritual practice required working with human nature, not against it. Too much comfort weakens us, making us soft and dependent on external pleasures. But too much austerity also fails. It breaks us down physically and psychologically until we're incapable of the very practices we're trying to maintain. The key, Benedict discovered, was finding the right balance, the sustainable middle path. This wasn't compromise or weakness, it was wisdom. It was understanding that human transformation is a marathon, not a sprint, and that the practices that will carry you through decades must be moderate enough to maintain while still challenging enough to produce growth. The second major discovery Benedict made in the cave concerned the nature of desire and temptation. The famous episode occurred probably in his second year of solitude. Benedict had been progressing well in his spiritual disciplines, feeling increasingly detached from worldly concerns. But then, without warning, he was assaulted by intense memories of a beautiful young woman he'd seen in Rome. The memory became an obsession, the desire overwhelming. He found himself on the verge of leaving the cave, abandoning his retreat, returning to the city to seek her out. In that critical moment, Benedict did something that seems shocking to modern sensibilities, but reveals sophisticated psychological understanding. He stripped off his robe and threw himself naked into a patch of thorn bushes and nettles growing near the cave entrance, rolling in them until his body was covered with cuts and welts. The pain so intense, it completely disrupted the mental pattern of desire that had been consuming him. This wasn't masochism. It was a sophisticated understanding of how to redirect psychological energy, how to break destructive thought loops before they become overwhelming. Benedict understood something that modern psychology has confirmed: that intense physical sensation can interrupt psychological states, that the body and mind aren't separate but deeply interconnected. By creating an overwhelming physical sensation, he disrupted the mental obsession. And crucially, he reports that after this experience, he was never again troubled by sexual temptation of that intensity. He'd broken the pattern decisively. This experience taught Benedict important lessons about human psychology. He learned that desire isn't something you can simply suppress through willpower. It must be redirected, transformed. He learned that the body and mind influence each other in complex ways, that working with the body can change mental states. And he learned that sometimes decisive action, even action that seems extreme in the moment, is necessary to break patterns that threaten to derail your entire practice. The third major insight Benedict gained from his cave years concerned rhythm and structure. Left entirely to his own devices, with nothing external to organize his days, Benedict had to create his own patterns: times for prayer, for physical work, maintaining his cave and collecting water and food, for rest, for contemplation of Scripture. He discovered that human flourishing requires rhythm, that we need regular patterns and predictable structures. This wasn't because we're machines that need programming. Rather, it's because we're creatures who thrive on meaningful repetition, who build our lives through habits and practices that become second nature. Without rhythm and structure, we tend to oscillate between extremes, working frantically when motivated, then collapsing into lethargy. Or we waste tremendous energy constantly deciding what to do next, negotiating with ourselves about every action. Benedict created for himself a daily rhythm: rising before dawn, praying the Psalms he'd memorized, doing whatever physical work was needed, dedicating time to silent contemplation, resting when necessary. This rhythm wasn't rigid. It adapted to seasons and circumstances, but it provided a container for his experience, a structure that made each day meaningful rather than just a formless flow of time. Most importantly, Benedict discovered in solitude what community would require. This might seem paradoxical, but it's philosophically profound. He learned that you can't build authentic relationships, can't create genuine community, until you first learn to be alone with yourself, without constant distraction. Most people flee into social activity to escape themselves. They can't bear their own company, can't face their own thoughts and feelings without buffering them with interaction and entertainment. Benedict spent 3 years learning to be alone with himself, to face everything that arose in consciousness without escape or distraction. He confronted his desires, his fears, his grandiose fantasies, his petty resentments, his moments of despair, and his moments of transcendent joy. He learned to observe all of this without being completely identified with it, without assuming that every thought and feeling was profound truth. rather than just weather passing through consciousness. This created a stable, coherent self that would later have something genuine to offer others. If you don't know yourself, if you're not comfortable in your own company, you'll use other people to fill the void inside you. You'll demand that they validate you, complete you, fix you. You can't really see them clearly because you need too much from them. Benedict's years of solitude created a foundation of self-knowledge and self-sufficiency that made genuine relationship possible. The cave years also taught Benedict about spiritual combat and the reality of interior struggle. Medieval sources describe this in terms of demonic temptation, devils appearing to Benedict, tormenting him, trying to drive him from his retreat. We might interpret this differently today, understanding these as projections of Benedict's own psychological struggles, the parts of himself that resisted transformation. But the experience was real, regardless of interpretation. Benedict faced moments of crushing doubt, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he was wasting his life in pointless isolation. He faced terror and loneliness, despair and confusion. What he learned was that transformation isn't a smooth upward progression. It's a struggle with advances and retreats, victories and defeats. The path toward wisdom and virtue requires perseverance through periods when everything seems pointless, when you can't feel whatever motivated you to start, when you just want to give up and return to comfortable mediocrity. Benedict learned to continue the practice even when he couldn't feel its purpose, trusting that meaning would return if he persevered. Gradually, word of Benedict's retreat began to spread. Shepherds, who occasionally passed through the area, discovered the strange young man living in the cave. Initially frightened, he must have looked wild after years alone, dressed in rough animal skins, gaunt from fasting. They eventually approached him and were struck by his gentleness and wisdom. They began visiting regularly, bringing him better food than Romanus's bread, and more importantly, bringing him their questions and struggles. Benedict discovered that he had a gift for spiritual direction, for seeing into people's situations and offering guidance. He could discern patterns in their lives that they couldn't see themselves. He could ask questions that led them to their own insights rather than just giving advice. This experience would prove crucial when he eventually became a teacher and leader of monastic communities. He understood that transformation can't be imposed from outside, but must emerge from each person's own growing awareness. In his third year in the cave, a pivotal event occurred. A priest from a nearby village, while preparing his Easter meal, received a divine inspiration, or perhaps just a sudden strong feeling, that he shouldn't feast while Benedict suffered hunger in a cave. The priest gathered the food he'd prepared and set out to find Benedict, guided by some intuition across the rough terrain until he discovered the cave. The encounter was deeply moving. Here was Benedict, who'd left the world behind, seeking only God, being reminded that he was still part of human community, that others cared about his well-being, that his isolation couldn't be absolute. The priest shared the Easter meal with Benedict and delivered a message that would change everything. It's Easter, the feast of Christ's resurrection. You shouldn't fast today, and I think God has other plans for you than permanent solitude. Your light shouldn't remain hidden. This visit marked the end of Benedict's strictly solitary period and the beginning of his life as a teacher and spiritual father. He'd completed his preparation in the cave. He'd learned what he needed to learn about himself, about human nature, about the conditions necessary for transformation. Now, it was time to return to the world, not to the corrupt society he'd fled, but to create communities that embodied different values, different ways of organizing human life together. From hermit to teacher, the birth of a system, Benedict's emergence from the cave attracted immediate attention. His reputation for holiness had spread during his years of solitude, carried by the shepherds and others who'd encountered him. Soon, men were seeking him out, asking to become his disciples, to learn from him how to live a life centered on seeking God. Benedict was hesitant. He'd come to the mountains seeking solitude, not to become a teacher. But he couldn't ignore what seemed like divine providence bringing these seekers to him. His first major test as a teacher came when monks from a nearby monastery in Vicovaro approached him. Their abbot had died, and they unanimously wanted Benedict to lead them. Benedict was reluctant, warning them that his standards might be too demanding, that his vision of monastic life might not align with their comfortable customs. But they insisted, promising to submit to his guidance. So Benedict left his beloved cave and took on the responsibility of leading an established community. It was a disaster. The monks at Vicovaro weren't really interested in transformation. They wanted a holy figurehead who would lend spiritual legitimacy to their comfortable lifestyle. When Benedict began implementing serious discipline, expecting them to pray more, work more, live more simply, they resented it bitterly. The tension escalated over months. Benedict held firm to his standards, believing that authentic monastic life required genuine commitment and sacrifice. The monks grew increasingly hostile. Finally, a group of them decided to solve their problem permanently. They would poison their troublesome new abbot. They prepared a cup of wine laced with deadly poison and offered it to Benedict during a meal. Benedict, as was his custom, made the sign of the cross over the cup before drinking, a simple gesture of blessing. At that moment, according to accounts, the cup shattered as if struck by an invisible force, spilling the poisoned wine across the table. Benedict looked at the monks with sadness rather than anger. "May God forgive you, brothers," he said quietly. "Didn't I warn you that my ways weren't in harmony with yours? Seek an abbot after your own heart. I won't remain among you any longer." He returned to his cave at Subiaco, and this apparent failure might have been the end of his teaching career. But it proved to be a crucial lesson. Benedict learned that you can't force people toward growth they don't genuinely desire. Authentic transformation requires real consent, actual willingness to embrace difficulty and change. You can't impose enlightenment on people or drag them toward virtue against their will. The best you can do is create conditions where growth becomes possible for those who truly want it, and let others go their own way without bitterness. This insight would shape everything about how Benedict structured monastic life going forward. He would only accept people who demonstrated genuine commitment, who understood that they were signing up for a demanding path, not a comfortable refuge from the world. He wouldn't waste energy trying to motivate the unmotivated or force discipline on those who resented it. Better to work with a few genuinely committed people than lead a large community of the reluctantly religious. When Benedict returned to Subiaco, he found that the number of sincere seekers wanting to learn from him had grown considerably. These were men who'd heard about his way of life and genuinely wanted to pursue it, not comfort-seeking monks looking for an easier path, but individuals ready for serious spiritual work. With these disciples, Benedict began developing the organizational structure that would become his lasting contribution. Rather than creating one large monastery, Benedict established 12 small communities of 12 monks each, distributing them throughout the valleys around Subiaco. Each community had its own superior chosen by Benedict, while he himself maintained overall supervision and personally trained the youngest monks and those showing particular aptitude for spiritual leadership. This decentralized but cohesive structure was remarkably sophisticated, a federated network rather than a rigid hierarchy, emphasizing what would later be called subsidiarity and distributed leadership, while maintaining clear ultimate authority. This structure addressed several important problems. First, it kept communities small enough that genuine relationships could develop between all members. Once groups grow beyond about 12 to 15 people, they start fragmenting into cliques, and you lose the intimate accountability and shared life that makes transformation possible. In small communities, everyone knows everyone else, and you can't hide your patterns or coast anonymously. Second, the structure allowed for adaptation to local circumstances while maintaining overall coherence. Each small monastery could develop its own rhythm and personality, could adapt to the particular geography and resources of its location, could respond to local needs. But they all followed the same basic principles, maintained the same fundamental practices, and recognized Benedict's overall authority. Third, this structure created opportunities for developing new leaders. The superiors of the 12 monasteries learned to exercise authority on a small scale, to guide their brothers, to manage resources, to discern when to be firm and when to be flexible. Some of these men would later found their own monasteries, spreading Benedict's approach to new regions. Benedict was building not just communities, but a movement, a whole new way of organizing Christian life. The monks who came to Benedict in this period were diverse. Some were former soldiers seeking a new kind of discipline. Others were educated Romans fleeing the chaos of collapsing civilization. Still others were simple farmers or craftsmen hoping for something more than their ordinary lives offered. Benedict welcomed them all, understanding that transformation is possible for anyone genuinely seeking it, regardless of background or education. Among these early disciples, several would become particularly significant. There was Maurus, son of a Roman senator, who entered the monastery as a young boy and became like a son to Benedict. The old accounts say that Maurus once walked on water to rescue another monk who was drowning. Perhaps metaphorical, perhaps not, but clearly he developed remarkable spiritual capacities under Benedict's guidance. There was also Placidus, another young aristocrat sent to Benedict for education. The relationship between Benedict and these young disciples reveals an important dimension of his philosophy. He understood that formation in virtue and wisdom happens best through apprenticeship, through living closely with someone who embodies what you're trying to become. You can't learn this stuff from books alone. You need to watch someone navigate difficult situations, see how they handle conflict and disappointment, observe their habits and practices over months and years. Benedict's approach to teaching was personal and adaptive. He'd observe each monk carefully, discerning their particular strengths and weaknesses, their specific struggles and gifts. Some monks needed firm correction, others gentle encouragement. Some required more structure and discipline, others more freedom and space for individual initiative. Benedict learned to read people, to understand what each person needed for growth and provide it, even when that meant treating different people differently. This required tremendous wisdom and maturity. It's much easier to have one set of rules that applies uniformly to everyone, simpler to administer, less open to accusations of favoritism. But Benedict understood that authentic spiritual direction must account for individual differences. What helps one person grow might hinder another. The abbot's role is discerning these differences and responding appropriately, not mechanically applying identical treatment to everyone. The years at Subiaco weren't without challenges beyond the poisoning at Vicovaro. A local priest named Florentius became consumed with jealousy at Benedict's growing reputation and influence. He began spreading slanders about Benedict and his monks, attempting to undermine them. When that didn't work, he tried more direct sabotage, sending the monks poisoned bread as a supposed gift, even introducing 7 naked women into the monastery gardens to tempt the monks away from their vows. Benedict's response to this persecution is revealing. He wasn't primarily concerned about his own reputation or even about defending his communities against these attacks. His main worry was for his monks. That exposure to this level of malice and temptation might harm their spiritual development, especially the younger ones who weren't yet firmly established in their practice. So he made the difficult decision to leave Subiaco, to take his most committed disciples and seek a new location where they could continue their work without this constant harassment. This willingness to let go, to start over when circumstances required it, reflects an important principle in Benedict's philosophy. He understood that you can't control everything, that sometimes the best response to malice is simply to move out of its range rather than fighting endlessly. There's a kind of spiritual pragmatism here. Focus your energy on what you're trying to build, not on defending yourself against those who want to tear you down. Don't let your enemy determine your agenda. So in 529, guided by what he understood as divine providence, Benedict set out south with a core group of disciples. Their destination was Monte Cassino, a mountain about halfway between Rome and Naples. This would become Benedict's masterpiece, the place where he'd write his rule and establish the monastery that would become the mother house of the Benedictine order. Monte Cassino, building the model. Community. Monte Cassino rises about 1,700 feet above the surrounding plain, a steep-sided mountain with commanding views in all directions. When Benedict and his monks reached the summit, they found the ruins of an ancient temple dedicated to Apollo and a sacred grove where local peasants still practiced pagan rites. The Roman Empire had officially been Christian for 2 centuries, but in rural areas, old beliefs died hard. People still made offerings to the old gods, still performed rituals their ancestors had practiced for millennia. Benedict saw this not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. He would bring the gospel to this place steeped in paganism, transforming it from a center of idol worship to a beacon of Christian learning and prayer. But he wouldn't accomplish this through mere destruction or condemnation. Benedict understood something sophisticated about cultural transformation. You can't just tear down the old without offering something better to replace it. So Benedict began preaching to the local population, explaining the Christian message in ways they could understand, demonstrating through his own life and that of his monks an alternative to the pagan worldview. He performed miracles that convinced many, healings, provisions for the hungry, demonstrations of knowledge he couldn't have obtained naturally. Gradually, the people began to convert, abandoning their pagan practices and embracing Christianity. Once the population was largely converted, Benedict directed the destruction of the pagan temple and the cutting down of the sacred grove. On the ruins of Apollo's temple, he constructed a church dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours, a former soldier who'd become a monk and then a bishop, who'd effectively combated paganism in Gaul. Next to this church, Benedict built an oratory dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, that austere prophet who'd lived in the desert, preparing the way for Christ. The choice of these dedications was significant. Martin represented the combination of action and contemplation, the soldier-monk bishop who'd engaged effectively with the world while maintaining his spiritual focus. John the Baptist represented radical commitment and prophetic witness, the willingness to stand apart from corrupt society and call people back to fundamental truths. Together, these figures embodied the balance Benedict sought: engagement with the world, but not corruption by it; prophetic clarity without escapist withdrawal. The monastery buildings were designed according to principles Benedict had developed through years of experience. He understood that architecture shapes behavior, that the physical environment in which you live influences how you live. So he designed Monte Cassino to facilitate the kind of life he envisioned: spaces for communal prayer that would draw the community together regularly, spaces for silent work and study, spaces for meals eaten in common while listening to spiritual reading, spaces for guests to be welcomed and cared for without disrupting the monk's routine. The cloister, an enclosed courtyard surrounded by covered walkways, became the heart of the monastery. This was a world within a world, a space set apart from secular concerns where different values governed, where time moved to a different rhythm. Walking the cloister, monks could meditate, could have necessary conversations, could simply be present in a space dedicated to the sacred. The church was the architectural and spiritual center, the place where the community gathered 7 times daily for the divine office, the liturgy of the hours that structured monastic life. Benedict designed the monks' daily rhythm around these regular times of communal prayer. Before dawn, they'd gather for vigils, the night office. Then at dawn came lauds, praising God at the day's beginning. Then prime at 6 a.m., terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 p.m., vespers at sunset, and finally compline before bed. This meant that no stretch of the day went longer than 3 hours without the community gathering to pray together. This rhythm served multiple purposes beyond the obvious religious ones. It prevented work from becoming obsessive or all-consuming. Just when you were getting deeply focused on some project, the bell would ring calling you to prayer. You had to stop, let go, shift your attention. This trained a kind of healthy detachment where you could engage fully with work, but also disengage when necessary. Work was important, but not ultimate. The regular rhythm also created profound social cohesion. You prayed with your brothers, not because you necessarily felt like it, or because you were getting along with everyone at the moment, but because you'd committed to this practice. Personality conflicts and individual moods became less important when the community gathered regularly for something that transcended personal preferences. Over time, this created bonds deeper than mere friendship. You were united by shared practice, by a common orientation, by collective rhythm. News of the new monastery spread rapidly, attracting men from across Italy who wanted to embrace monastic life. Monte Cassino quickly grew larger than the small communities Benedict had established at Subiaco. This presented new challenges. How do you maintain genuine community, real relationships, meaningful accountability when numbers grow beyond the intimate scale? Benedict addressed this partly through organization, dividing the monks into smaller groups for work and certain other activities, appointing deans to oversee groups of 10 monks, creating structures that preserved human scale even as the overall community grew. But he also recognized that there were limits to how large a monastery should become. Beyond a certain size, you lose the intimacy and accountability that make transformation possible. Better to found a new monastery than to let a single community grow so large it becomes impersonal. The monks at Monte Cassino came from all social classes. There were sons of nobles like Maurus and Placidus, educated Romans fleeing the chaos of collapsing civilization. There were former soldiers and craftsmen, farmers and merchants. Some were educated and could read Latin fluently. Others were barely literate. Some came as adults with life experience behind them. Others entered as children, given to the monastery by their parents in hopes they'd receive good formation. Benedict insisted that in the monastery, all these social distinctions became irrelevant. A former slave and a former senator were equal brothers, subject to the same rules, sharing the same simple food and rough clothing. This was genuinely radical for his time. Roman society was intensely hierarchical, with elaborate protocols governing how people of different classes should interact. But Benedict understood that authentic community requires fundamental equality, that people can't really see each other as brothers when social hierarchy constantly reminds them of their relative status. This doesn't mean Benedict eliminated all hierarchy within the monastery. There was the abbot with his authority, deans who supervised groups of monks, the prior who served as second in command. But these roles were based on spiritual maturity and capacity to guide others, not on birth or wealth. A former slave could become prior if he showed wisdom and virtue. A noble's son would remain a simple monk if that was appropriate to his development. The work life at Monte Cassino reflected Benedict's principle that monks should be self-sufficient, not living parasitically off others' labor. The monastery needed to produce what it consumed: food, clothing, tools, furniture. So monks worked as farmers and gardeners, bakers and brewers, weavers and cobblers, carpenters and stonemasons. Everyone worked, including the abbot, setting an example that labor was dignified and necessary, not something to be avoided or looked down upon. This emphasis on manual labor was actually controversial. Many people thought that monks should focus exclusively on prayer and spiritual practices, that physical work was a distraction from their true calling. But Benedict disagreed profoundly. He believed that work was essential to human flourishing, that we need to engage with material reality, to feel the resistance of the world, to see concrete results from our efforts. Work kept monks grounded, prevented them from becoming lost in their heads, taught humility through direct confrontation with their actual capacities and limits. The monastery also became a center of learning. Benedict valued both prayer and study, understanding that the mind needs nourishment just as the body does. he established a scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts, both biblical texts and classical works of literature, history, and philosophy. This work of preservation was crucial during the chaos of the early Middle Ages, when barbarian invasions destroyed libraries and classical learning was in danger of being lost entirely. Monks spent several hours daily in Lectio Divina, sacred reading and meditation on Scripture. But they also read the Church Fathers, the great theologians and spiritual writers of previous centuries. They studied practical subjects too: agriculture, medicine, architecture, whatever knowledge was needed to run a self-sufficient community effectively. Benedict valued learning not as an end in itself, but as a means of serving God and neighbor more effectively. Monte Cassino also practiced hospitality, welcoming travelers and pilgrims, caring for the sick and poor. Benedict insisted that guests should be received as Christ himself, that the monastery shouldn't be a closed community turned in on itself, but a center of charity serving the broader region. This created relationships with the surrounding population, showing that monastic withdrawal from society didn't mean indifference to others' needs. The reputation of Monte Cassino and its holy founder spread far beyond the immediate region. Totila, king of the Ostrogoths, who then ruled Italy, heard about Benedict and decided to test whether the monk truly possessed the prophetic gifts attributed to him. He sent one of his officers dressed in royal regalia, accompanied by a grand retinue, to present himself as the king. As soon as the officer entered the monastery, Benedict addressed him. "My son, take off those clothes that don't belong to you." The charade was immediately exposed. Totila then visited Benedict personally, prostrating himself before the holy abbot. Benedict rebuked him for his cruelties and prophesied about his future. "You've done much evil and continue to do so. Stop now from committing iniquities. You'll enter Rome, cross the sea, reign for 9 years, and die in the 10th. Everything happened exactly as Benedict foretold. Totila, though he didn't completely abandon his violent ways, did moderate them considerably after this encounter, showing more mercy than before. This episode reveals Benedict's engagement with political power. He didn't seek influence with rulers, didn't curry favor, or try to become politically important. But when power came to him, when kings sought his counsel, he spoke truth without fear, rebuking injustice regardless of who perpetrated it. He understood that authentic spiritual authority comes from integrity and holiness, not from position or connections, and that such authority, when recognized, can sometimes influence even violent rulers toward greater mercy. Monte Cassino became a model that would be replicated across Europe, a community combining prayer and work, stability and learning, discipline and charity. It showed that even as civilization crumbled around it, it was possible to create islands of order and meaning, places where human beings could flourish, and where the best of both classical and Christian culture could be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The rule, balance and moderation as philosophical principles. In the Peace of Monte Cassino, Benedict completed the writing of his most influential work, The Rule of the Monks, or Benedictine Rule, as it would later be known. This document, consisting of a prologue and 73 short chapters, distills the wisdom Benedict had accumulated over decades of monastic experience and deep intimacy with God. The rule didn't arise suddenly, nor was it the result of a sudden illumination. It was the mature fruit of years of reflection, prayer, and the daily practice of consecrated life. To understand the rule's significance, you need to know what came before it. Earlier forms of Christian monasticism, especially in the East, often emphasized extreme asceticism that pushed human limits. Desert fathers in Egypt and Syria competed in feats of self-denial. Who could go longest without sleep? Who could survive on the least food? Who could endure the most uncomfortable conditions? Some monks spent decades living on top of pillars exposed to the elements. Others ate only what they could forage wild, refusing all cultivated food. Still others maintained absolute silence for years or decades. These practices produced remarkable individuals, saints whose holiness was undeniable, whose prayers worked miracles, whose very presence radiated divine power. But Benedict recognized a problem. Such extreme practices couldn't form the basis for a sustainable community or a transferable way of life accessible to ordinary people. Most individuals attempting such severity would either burn out quickly, damage themselves physically or psychologically, or, perhaps worst of all, become prideful about their accomplishments, mistaking impressive ascetic feats for genuine holiness. Benedict also studied earlier monastic rules, particularly the Rule of the Master, an anonymous Italian text that was quite harsh and detailed, and the rules of Basil the Great and Augustine of Hippo from the Eastern and African traditions. He drew on all these sources, taking what seemed wise and adapting it, discarding what seemed excessive or impractical. What emerged was something distinctive, a rule characterized by balance, moderation, and what Benedict called discretion. "We're establishing a school of the Lord's service," he wrote in the prologue, "in which we hope to establish nothing harsh or burdensome." This was remarkable for its time. Wasn't the spiritual life supposed to be harsh and burdensome? Wasn't suffering the path to holiness? Benedict disagreed with this assumption. He believed that authentic transformation came not from heroic extremes, but from sustained, moderate practice over long periods. Better to pray moderately every day for decades than to have intense spiritual experiences that burn you out within months. Better to fast reasonably in ways you can sustain for a lifetime than to starve yourself dramatically until health collapses. This philosophy of moderation pervades every aspect of the rule. Benedict prescribed about 8 hours of sleep, revolutionary when many religious groups considered sleep itself a dangerous indulgence. He mandated sufficient food, though simple and without luxury. 2 meals a day was standard, with adjustments for seasons and the demands of work. Each meal should include 2 cooked dishes so that monks with different dietary needs or preferences could find something suitable, plus a pound of bread and a measure of wine. This last provision, wine, surprises many modern readers who assume monasteries were places of total abstinence. But Benedict was Mediterranean, and moderate wine consumption was part of normal life in his culture. He wrote, "We read that wine isn't suitable for monks at all. But since monks nowadays can't be convinced of this, let's at least agree to drink moderately and not to satiety. For wine makes even the wise go astray." There's humor here, a recognition of human nature and cultural realities. Benedict would rather have monks drink moderately than set a standard of total abstinence that many would break hypocritically. The rule balances various aspects of life carefully. The divine office, the liturgy of the hours, structures the day, with monks gathering 7 times during daylight and once at night to pray together. But this shouldn't consume all their time. Benedict allocates several hours daily for manual labor, farming, crafts, building, whatever work the monastery requires. He also prescribes time for lectio divina, spiritual reading and meditation, and sufficient time for meals, rest, and the necessary business of running a community. This careful allocation of time reflects Benedict's understanding that human beings have multiple dimensions that all need attention. We're not purely spiritual beings who can pray constantly. We have bodies that need exercise and work. We have minds that need nourishment through reading and study. We have social natures that need community interaction. We need rhythms of activity and rest, engagement and reflection. A balanced life honors all these dimensions, integrating them into a coherent whole rather than privileging one at the expense of others. Perhaps most sophisticated is Benedict's recognition that different people need different things. The rule contains numerous provisions for adjusting requirements based on individual circumstances. The sick shouldn't fast as the healthy do. They need more food and rest to recover. The elderly need special consideration, allowed to eat earlier than others if necessary. The young need different formation than mature monks, more active oversight and instruction. Those engaged in heavy physical labor need more food than those primarily studying. What matters isn't mechanically following identical practices, but growing toward the same goal: love of God and neighbor, transformation of character, increasing wisdom and compassion. Through whatever means, work for your particular situation. This reveals a deep philosophical insight about means and ends. Benedict understood that specific practices are means toward the end of transformation, not ends in themselves. When people fetishize particular practices, making them obligatory regardless of effect, the means become obstacles rather than pathways. The rule's longest chapter concerns humility, outlining 12 steps from awareness of God's presence to bodily comportment that reflects interior meekness. We'll explore humility in depth later, but its centrality in the rule reveals Benedict's priorities. Not extreme asceticism, not miraculous experiences, not impressive accomplishments, but humble realism, seeing yourself, others, and God clearly without ego distortion. This is the heart of spiritual transformation. Benedict's treatment of authority is also sophisticated. The abbot governs the monastery, but his authority isn't arbitrary or tyrannical. He must consult the whole community on important matters, listening especially to the youngest monks in whom the Holy Spirit may inspire particular wisdom. He should consider different perspectives before deciding. Once he does decide, he has authority to act, but he'll answer to God for how he exercises this authority, particularly for how he treats those under his care. This creates a balance between authority and consultation, between decisive leadership and collaborative discernment. The abbot isn't a democrat constantly taking votes. He has real authority to govern. But he's not an autocrat either. He must listen, consult, consider different views. This reflects Benedict's broader philosophical commitment to balance rather than extremes. The rule also addresses how monks should treat each other. They should practice mutual obedience, not just obeying the abbot, but also accommodating each other's needs and preferences where possible. They should speak gently, avoiding harsh words that damage relationships. They should reconcile quickly when conflicts arise, not letting resentment fester. They should honor the elderly and love the young. They should welcome guests as Christ himself. These teachings create a framework for genuine community, for people living together in ways that foster growth rather than just tolerating each other's presence. Benedict understood that community itself is ascetical practice, maybe the most difficult and transformative practice. It's relatively easy to maintain a pleasant spirituality when you're alone in a cave. It's much harder to remain kind and patient when you're living with the same people day after day, when their quirks irritate you, when you can't escape personality conflicts. The rule's emphasis on stability, one of the 3 vows Benedictine monks take along with obedience and conversion of life, forces monks to work through difficulties rather than running from them. You can't leave just because you're frustrated or bored. You can't blame the community for all your problems when you've been there for 20 years. You have to take responsibility for your contribution to situations, learn to communicate, develop skills for navigating conflict. Benedict also understood the importance of rhythm and routine in spiritual life. The rule establishes patterns that structure time meaningfully, daily rhythms of prayer, work, and rest, weekly rhythms with slight variations on different days, annual rhythms following the liturgical calendar with its seasons of feasting and fasting. These rhythms create containers for experience, making time significant rather than just a formless flow. Modern people often resist routine, seeing it as boring or confining. We value spontaneity and freedom, wanting to do whatever we feel like whenever we feel like it. But Benedict understood that authentic freedom comes through commitment to meaningful patterns, not from lack of structure. When good practices become habitual, when virtue becomes second nature through regular practice, you're freed from constant decision-making and negotiation with yourself. You can simply live well without it requiring constant effort and willpower. The rule's moderation also had important practical implications. Because Benedict's form of monasticism was sustainable and accessible, not requiring extraordinary stamina or exceptional spiritual gifts, it could spread widely. Ordinary people of reasonable commitment could follow the rule successfully. This democratized serious spiritual practice, making it available beyond a small elite of spiritual athletes. This accessibility was crucial for Benedict's broader impact on Western civilization. Because his monasticism was transferable and sustainable, it could be replicated across Europe. Benedictine monasteries became islands of stability, learning, and productivity throughout the chaos of the early Middle Ages. They preserved not just religious tradition, but classical learning, agricultural knowledge, architectural and engineering skills, musical traditions, and the basic conditions for civilized community life. The rule has proven remarkably durable. For over 1,500 years, it's guided monastic life across dramatically different cultures and circumstances. It's been translated into hundreds of languages. It's been adapted for use by lay people who aren't monks, but find its wisdom applicable to ordinary life. This longevity testifies to Benedict's genius. He developed principles flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential integrity. Humility, the philosophical core. At the heart of Benedict's philosophy stands his teaching on humility. Chapter 7 of the Rule, the longest chapter, describes 12 steps of humility that together comprise his vision of human transformation. But we need to be careful here. Benedict's concept of humility is profoundly different from what that word often suggests today. Modern culture tends to understand humility as thinking poorly of yourself, as diminishing your abilities and worth, perhaps even as a useful neurosis that prevents arrogance. High self-esteem is valued. Humility is often seen as weakness or false modesty. That's not what Benedict meant at all. His humility is better understood as realism, as seeing clearly, seeing yourself, others, and reality accurately without the distortions of ego and self-centeredness. The first step of humility in Benedict's teaching is keeping the awareness of God always before you. This isn't primarily about religious observance, though it certainly includes that. Philosophically, it's about maintaining awareness of your place in a larger order, about remembering that reality doesn't revolve around you and your concerns, that you're participating in something vastly larger than yourself. This awareness prevents the fundamental error of egocentrism, the usually unconscious assumption that you're the center of reality, that everything ultimately relates to you and your interests. Much of our suffering comes from this basic mistake. When we forget our actual place in the order of things, we make ourselves miserable through impossible expectations and constant disappointment that reality doesn't conform to our preferences. Think about how this plays out in ordinary life. You get angry when traffic delays you, as if the purpose of all those other cars and drivers was to get out of your way. You're devastated when someone doesn't like you, as if others exist primarily to validate you. You're outraged when things don't work out as you planned, as if reality had an obligation to match your expectations. All of this stems from a subtle but pervasive sense that you're the main character in the story, that everyone else is basically supporting cast in the drama of your life. Benedict's first step of humility corrects this delusion. When you keep awareness of God, of ultimate reality, of the larger order in which you're a participant but not the center, you see yourself more accurately. You're important, valuable, worthy of dignity and care. But so is everyone else. The world wasn't created for your convenience. The second step of humility is not loving your own will, but choosing what God wills. Translated into philosophical language, this means aligning yourself with reality as it is, rather than demanding that reality conform to your preferences. It means developing the wisdom to distinguish between what you can change and what you must accept, and the flexibility to respond appropriately to each. This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Benedict wasn't counseling apathy or resignation. Rather, he's pointing toward a sophisticated understanding of human agency. We have real capacity to affect our circumstances, to make choices that matter, but we don't control everything. A huge amount of what happens to us and around us is beyond our power to change. Wisdom lies in discerning the difference and investing energy appropriately. When you constantly resist what you can't change, you waste tremendous energy in futile struggle. You make yourself miserable fighting battles you can't win. But when you accept what is, not with despair, but with clear-eyed realism, energy becomes available for engaging effectively where you actually can make a difference. The third step of humility involves submitting to a superior's guidance with patient obedience. In monastic context, this means following the abbot's directions even when you disagree or don't understand the reasoning. In broader philosophical terms, it's about recognizing that you don't have all the answers, that others sometimes see things you miss, that submitting to guidance from those wiser or more experienced can be beneficial even when it's uncomfortable. Modern culture valorizes radical autonomy. You don't need anyone telling you what to do. You're the ultimate authority on your own life. You should trust only yourself. This makes us unteachable, unable to benefit from others' wisdom and experience. Benedict understood that authentic growth requires humility to receive correction and instruction, willingness to try approaches that don't immediately make sense to you, trust that others might see your blind spots better than you do. The 4th through 6th steps concern enduring difficulty without complaint or resentment. When you're assigned hard or unpleasant tasks, when you face criticism or unjust treatment, when circumstances are disappointing, accept these experiences without bitterness or protest. This seems harsh to modern sensibilities. Shouldn't you stand up for yourself? Shouldn't you resist unfair treatment? Benedict isn't counseling passive acceptance of abuse. The rule also discusses when and how superiors should be challenged if they command something truly wrong. Rather, these steps address our tendency to make ourselves miserable through constant resistance to any difficulty or discomfort, our habit of complaining about anything that doesn't suit our preferences. When you accept difficulty without resentment, not because you're weak, but because you're wise enough to recognize that life includes challenges, that growth often requires discomfort, that not everything revolves around your comfort and convenience, you develop tremendous psychological strength. You're not buffered by circumstances because you don't expect life to be constantly pleasant. The 7th step involves believing yourself the worst of all people. This sounds like unhealthy self-deprecation until you understand what Benedict means. He's not saying to believe false things about yourself or to wallow in self-loathing. Rather, he's pointing toward awareness that you know your own faults intimately in ways you don't know others' faults. You see the unedited version of yourself, all the petty thoughts, selfish impulses, mean reactions you manage to hide from others. When you compare your messy interior experience with others' edited public presentations, you inevitably assume they're better than you, more patient, more generous, more disciplined. This isn't accurate, but it creates a kind of practical humility. If you assume everyone else is doing better than you are, you're less likely to become arrogant or judge others harshly. The 8th through 10th steps concern speech and behavior, speaking little and seriously rather than constantly joking or chattering, not being quick to laugh, speaking gently and humbly. These practices shape character from the outside in. How you speak affects how you think. Maintaining exterior humility gradually creates interior humility. Modern people often see this as inauthentic. Shouldn't you just express whatever you're feeling? Shouldn't your exterior match your interior exactly? Benedict understood something more subtle. Your interior and exterior influence each other bidirectionally. By disciplining exterior expression, you gradually shape interior reality. Acting patient helps you become patient. Speaking gently makes you more gentle. The outside and inside aren't separate, but form a feedback loop. The 11th step involves speaking rarely and briefly, without raising your voice. The 12th and final step is bearing humility, not just in your heart, but in your body, in your posture and gaze, in how you carry yourself through the world. By this point, humility has become so deeply integrated that it expresses naturally through everything you do. You're not performing humility externally while remaining proud internally. Humility has become your actual character, shaping thought, feeling, speech, and action. Benedict's teaching on humility ultimately aims at liberation. When you see clearly, when you're not constantly defending and promoting a false self-image, tremendous energy becomes available for more important pursuits. You're not wasting attention on managing your reputation or nursing your ego. You can engage with reality and with others more directly, more authentically, with less drama and defensive reactivity. Paradoxically, this kind of humility creates the foundation for genuine confidence and effectiveness. When your sense of self doesn't depend on constant validation or on maintaining a false image, you can actually take more risks, be more creative, engage more authentically. You're not afraid of failure or criticism exposing your inadequacy because you've already accepted your actual capabilities and limitations. True humility, in Benedict's understanding, makes you more capable, not less. It frees you from the exhausting work of ego maintenance, from constant comparison and competition, from the need to be right and admired. You can simply be yourself, flawed but real, limited but genuine, ordinary but authentic. And from this foundation of humble realism, actual growth and transformation become possible. Community, the crucible of transformation. Benedict's philosophy wasn't individualistic. He didn't believe people could achieve genuine transformation in isolation, at least not most people after initial formation. His monasteries were communities, and community life was essential to his philosophy, not just a practical arrangement for mutual support. This might seem to contradict what was said earlier about Benedict's years as a hermit. But Benedict came to understand his cave years as preparation for community, not as the ultimate goal. Solitude taught him about himself, helped him develop inner stability and self-knowledge. But the real work of transformation, he discovered, happened in relationship with others. Why is community essential? Because other people reveal dimensions of yourself that solitude never will. It's easy to imagine yourself patient when you're alone. Patience is tested by the brother who habitually arrives late to prayers, by the monk who chews loudly during silent meals, by the abbot whose leadership style frustrates you. Community brings you face to face with your actual reactions, your real patterns, your genuine capacities, rather than your idealized self-image. You can maintain all sorts of flattering delusions about yourself in solitude. You can imagine that you've conquered anger or pride or selfishness because you're not being triggered by anyone. But Benedict understood that authentic virtue must be tested in relationship. Love isn't real until it extends to actual difficult people, not just to humanity in the abstract or to people you naturally like. Benedict structured monastic community to maximize this transformative friction while preventing it from becoming destructive. The monastery wasn't a collection of isolated individuals who happened to live in the same building. It was an integrated whole where everyone's life affected everyone else's, where privacy was minimal, where you couldn't just avoid people you found difficult. Meals were communal, eaten in silence while one monk read aloud from scripture or spiritual texts. This enforced proximity meant you couldn't retreat to your room to eat alone when you were feeling antisocial. Prayer was communal, gathering the whole community 7 times daily, regardless of individual mood or preference. Even work was often done together rather than in isolation. Monks would work in groups in the fields or workshops, maintaining companionable silence or occasionally engaging in edifying conversation. You couldn't retreat into private space whenever community became uncomfortable. Such space barely existed in Benedict's monasteries. Monks slept in dormitories, not private rooms. They had almost no personal possessions beyond their basic clothing, and perhaps a knife and stylus for work. Everything was held in common, used as needed, rather than privately owned. This forced engagement created conditions for real growth in ways that voluntary associations rarely do. In modern life, when relationships become difficult, we can usually just leave, quit the job, end the friendship, move to a different city, ghost someone who's annoying us. This ability to exit prevents us from developing the capacities necessary for navigating inevitable human conflict and difference. We never learn to work through difficulties because we can always escape them. Benedict's commitment to stability removed that escape hatch. When conflict arose, and it inevitably did when you're living intimately with the same people for years, monks couldn't simply leave. The vow of stability bound them to this particular community. They had to figure out how to remain in relationship despite differences, how to repair ruptures, how to negotiate conflicts without destroying community or fleeing into isolation. Over years and decades, this developed extraordinary relational skills and genuine wisdom about human nature. You learned to recognize your own patterns, when you tended to withdraw, when you got defensive, what triggered you into anger or resentment. You learned to read others, to understand their quirks and sensitivities, to navigate around their vulnerabilities while being honest about problems that needed addressing. You developed humility about your own capacity to see situations clearly. Maybe you thought Brother Thomas was being lazy when he didn't complete his work, but then you learned he was actually sick and hadn't wanted to complain. Maybe you were sure Brother John was angry with you because he seemed cold, but actually, he was just worried about his elderly mother and was distracted, not upset. The community also functioned as a mirror, reflecting back to you how you were actually showing up rather than how you imagined you were showing up. You might think you're generous and self-sacrificing, but your brothers know that you always take the best piece of bread, always angle to avoid difficult work assignments. You might believe you're humble and teachable, but everyone else has noticed that you bristle at any suggestion or correction. Community doesn't let you maintain comfortable delusions about yourself. The role of the abbot in Benedict's philosophy deserves particular attention. The abbot wasn't just an administrator managing an institution. He was a spiritual father, teacher, physician of souls. Benedict dedicates several chapters of the Rule to describing how abbots should lead, with a combination of firmness and gentleness, authority and consultation, principle and flexibility. The abbot was supposed to know each monk individually, understanding their particular strengths, weaknesses, and needs. Leadership wasn't one size fits all. Some monks needed firm correction, others gentle encouragement. Some required more structure and close oversight. Others needed more freedom and space for individual initiative. The abbot's role was discerning what each person needed for growth and providing it, even when that meant treating different people differently. This required the abbot to be far along the path of transformation himself. You can't read other people's souls if you don't understand your own. You can't guide others through patterns you haven't worked through yourself. You can't recognize subtle spiritual movements if you're still lost in gross delusion about yourself. Benedict expected abbots to embody the wisdom they taught, to be living examples of the rule they enforced. The abbot also had to balance firmness and mercy. Too strict, and you crush spirits, create resentment, drive away those who could grow if treated more gently. Too lenient, and you enable mediocrity, allow community to decay through lack of discipline, fail to challenge people toward growth. The wise abbot discerns when to push and when to accommodate, when to insist and when to let go. Benedict warned abbots particularly against discouragement in their monks. The abbot should never drive anyone to despair through excessive demands or harsh treatment. He should adjust requirements for those who are struggling, offering support and encouragement rather than just condemnation. At the same time, he shouldn't lower standards for everyone just because some find them difficult. The art is supporting each person's growth toward the shared goal while recognizing that different people travel at different paces. The community also provided accountability in ways self-directed practice never can. When you make a commitment to yourself alone, you can always rationalize breaking it. No one's watching. No one will know. You can start again tomorrow. But when you've promised before a community to follow a certain way of life, when others are counting on you to fulfill your role, you can't so easily let yourself off the hook. The community holds you to your commitments even when your enthusiasm flags. This accountability extends beyond just following rules. It includes your relationships, your attitude, your spiritual practice, your work. If you're becoming bitter or resentful, your brothers will notice and can address it. If you're growing in patience and charity, they'll see that too and can affirm it. You're not navigating the spiritual path alone, making it up as you go. You're traveling with companions who know you, care about you, and can help you stay on track. Benedict understood another crucial dimension of community, that we need witnesses to our lives. Human beings have a deep need to be truly seen and known by others, to have our existence matter to people beyond ourselves. Genuine community provides this. Your brothers notice when you're struggling. They know your quirks and patterns. They see your growth over time. Your life makes a difference to them, and theirs to you. This is radically different from modern society's typical shallow connections. We might have hundreds of social media friends who know curated versions of us, but very few people who actually know us, our struggles and growth, our failures and victories, the full reality of our lives over time. Benedict's communities created conditions for that deeper knowing, for relationships that truly mattered and shaped who you became. The communal dimension of Benedictine life also had important economic and ecological implications. By sharing resources, living simply, and producing what they needed collectively, monasteries achieved a level of sustainability and stability that would have been impossible for isolated individuals. They demonstrated that human flourishing doesn't require endless acquisition and consumption. That richness of life can come from depth of community rather than breadth of possessions. The monastery produced most of what it consumed: food from farms and gardens, clothing from wool and flax they grew and processed, tools and furniture from their workshops, books from their scriptorium. They sold surpluses to support themselves and provide for the poor, but the goal wasn't profit maximization. The goal was sustainable community life that supported spiritual practice while serving the broader society. This communal economic model influenced medieval society broadly. Benedictine monasteries often became economic engines for their regions, introducing new agricultural techniques like crop rotation and irrigation systems, establishing schools and hospitals, providing employment for lay workers, offering charity to the poor. They showed that communities organized around principles other than profit maximization could be economically viable while serving broader social goods. Lectio Divina, the philosophy of deep reading. A central practice in Benedictine life was Lectio Divina, sacred reading. But again, this was something more philosophically sophisticated than the phrase might suggest. Benedict developed an approach to engaging with texts that has profound implications for how we relate to ideas and knowledge, implications that extend far beyond monastery walls. In Benedict's time, and for centuries after, books were rare and precious. Manuscripts had to be copied by hand, a laborious process requiring months or years of work. Monasteries might have a small library of a few dozen or perhaps a few hundred volumes. Most monks would be assigned particular texts to read slowly and repeatedly throughout the year, rather than having unlimited access to multiple books. This scarcity forced a different relationship to reading than we typically have today. You couldn't just consume book after book, moving quickly from one to the next. Instead, you read the same texts repeatedly: the Psalms, the Gospels, the Rule itself, perhaps some works of the Church Fathers. You became deeply familiar with these texts, memorizing substantial portions, returning to the same passages over and over. Lectio Divina structured this engagement with texts. The practice involved 4 movements. First, Lectio, reading slowly and attentively, allowing words and phrases to register fully, rather than rushing through to get to the end. You'd read a relatively short passage, perhaps just a few verses or a paragraph. Then came meditatio, meditation or rumination. You'd return to the passage or to particular phrases that struck you, repeating them, turning them over in your mind, considering them from different angles. What did this mean? How did it connect with your experience? What questions did it raise? You weren't analyzing intellectually so much as letting the text work on you, seeing what it stirred up, allowing it to reveal depths that weren't obvious on first reading. After meditation came oratio, prayer or response. You'd respond to what you'd read and contemplated, letting it guide your prayer or reflection. If the passage spoke of God's mercy, you might pray in gratitude or ask for greater capacity to receive and extend mercy. If it spoke of human weakness, you might confess your own struggles or ask for strength. The text became a springboard for deeper engagement with ultimate reality. Finally, if the practice went deep enough, it might lead to contemplation. This is the hardest to describe because it's beyond words and concepts. It's a wordless, resting in the presence and meaning you've encountered, a kind of communion that transcends intellectual understanding, not something you can force or achieve through technique, but a grace that sometimes emerges from faithful practice. This approach to reading formed a complete epistemology, a theory of knowledge quite different from our typical modern relationship to information. We tend to treat knowledge as something to acquire and accumulate, consuming texts rapidly to extract their information content. We value breadth over depth, surveying many texts superficially rather than engaging deeply with a few. We measure learning by how many books we've read, how much we know in the sense of information we can recall. Benedict's approach assumed that wisdom comes from depth, not breadth, from letting important ideas work on you over time, rather than constantly consuming new content. A few texts read deeply, returned to repeatedly, integrated into practice and reflection, memorized so they become part of your internal landscape. This produces more genuine understanding than consuming hundreds of books superficially. Think about the difference in your own life between books you've merely read versus books you've truly absorbed. Maybe there's a novel you read once years ago that profoundly affected you. That changed how you see the world. You didn't just consume it, it entered you, became part of how you think and feel. Or maybe there's a philosophical text you've returned to multiple times, finding new layers each time, seeing how it connects with more of your experience as you mature. These deeply absorbed texts shape you in ways that books you skim and forget never do. Lectio Divina is essentially a method for creating this kind of deep absorption intentionally rather than waiting for it to happen accidentally. It's a way of reading that prioritizes transformation over information acquisition. This has profound relevance for our information-saturated age. We're drowning in content, constantly consuming, but rarely truly digesting. We jump from article to article, video to video, never staying with anything long enough for it to genuinely transform us. We mistake information for knowledge and knowledge for wisdom. We think we're learning when we're really just accumulating facts and opinions that don't significantly change how we live. Benedict's Lectio Divina offers an alternative. What if instead of constantly seeking new content, we engage deeply with a small number of truly important texts? What if we read slowly, repeatedly, letting ideas settle into our consciousness and gradually reshape how we see and think? What if we valued transformation over information acquisition, depth over breadth, wisdom over cleverness? This applies beyond explicitly religious or philosophical texts. The practice of deep, repeated engagement with important ideas can apply to any domain. Reading a great novel slowly, returning to challenging passages, letting characters and situations reveal their depths over time. Studying a field by going deep into foundational texts rather than skimming many superficial introductions. Engaging with any complex idea in a way that allows it to genuinely change you rather than just adding to your collection of opinions. The contemplative dimension of Lectio Divina is particularly important philosophically. Contemplation, in Benedict's understanding, wasn't about having particular experiences or achieving special states of consciousness. It wasn't mystical in the sense of bizarre or exotic. It was about learning to rest in reality, to be present without constantly narrating and interpreting experience, to let yourself be held by something larger than your own thoughts and concerns. This capacity for contemplative presence, being fully engaged with reality without the constant mediation of conceptual thought and self-centered interpretation, is perhaps the deepest aim of Benedict's entire philosophy. All the practices, all the structure, all the discipline aim ultimately at creating human beings capable of this kind of presence, this quality of attention to reality as it actually is, rather than as filtered through ego and desire. Modern people often struggle to understand what contemplation means or why it matters. We're so conditioned to constant mental activity, to processing everything through concepts and categories, to relating to reality primarily through thinking about it rather than directly experiencing it. The idea of thought-free awareness seems either impossible or pointless. But Benedict understood that the thinking mind, while valuable and necessary, isn't the only or even the deepest way of knowing. There's a kind of awareness that precedes thought, that's more direct and immediate than conceptual understanding. contemplative practice cultivates this awareness, training the capacity to be present without constant mental commentary. This isn't about achieving blank-mindedness or suppressing thought. It's about developing flexibility to engage thoughts when useful and let them recede when they're not, rather than being constantly lost in compulsive thinking. It's about remembering that you're not identical with your thoughts, that there's an awareness within which thoughts arise and pass. Lectio Divina bridges intellectual and contemplative knowing. You engage the text intellectually through careful reading and meditation, but you also let the text lead you beyond intellect into direct presence. Both capacities are necessary. Both complement and support each other. Benedict wasn't anti-intellectual. His monasteries were centers of learning, but he understood that intellectual knowledge alone doesn't transform character or produce wisdom. The legacy. Why Benedict matters now. So why does any of this matter for us today, living in circumstances so different from 6th century Italy? Why should we care about the philosophy of a medieval monk? Because Benedict addressed questions that remain as relevant now as they were 100 years ago. Questions about meaning and purpose, about building sustainable communities, about balancing contemplation and action, about developing character and wisdom in a chaotic world. Our contemporary culture offers certain answers to these questions. It tells us meaning comes from individual achievement and accumulation, that communities are just collections of self-interested individuals, that contemplation is a luxury we can't afford in our busy lives, that character and wisdom matter less than credentials and connections, that endless growth and consumption are not just possible, but necessary for flourishing. These answers clearly aren't working. We're seeing epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and despair, despite material prosperity that previous generations couldn't have imagined. We're facing ecological crisis driven by unsustainable consumption. Our communities are fragmenting, our institutions failing, our sense of shared meaning and purpose eroding. The modern answers to fundamental questions about how to live aren't producing human flourishing or sustainable civilization. Benedict offers different answers, a different model. Meaning comes from participating in something larger than yourself, from contributing to genuine community, from aligning your life with enduring values rather than chasing status and possessions. Community requires commitment and stability, working through difficulties rather than constantly seeking better options. Contemplation isn't a luxury, but a necessity for maintaining sanity and wisdom amid complexity. Character and virtue aren't outdated concepts, but foundations for any life worth living. And sustainability requires moderation, balance between consumption and production, living within limits rather than constantly expanding. His philosophy of ora et labora, prayer and work, contemplation and action, addresses our culture's oscillation between frantic busyness and numbed-out collapse. We work frantically, often at jobs that don't truly fulfill us, then collapse into passive entertainment to recover, never finding the balance between engagement and rest, between doing and being. Benedict's rhythm of alternating between focused work and contemplative prayer offers a healthier pattern, a way of integrating activity and stillness rather than swinging between exhausting extremes. His teaching on stability challenges our culture of perpetual optionality and constant comparison. We're told to keep our options open, never commit fully, always be ready to jump to something better. Online culture intensifies this with constant exposure to alternative possibilities, different careers, different cities, different partners, different versions of ourselves we might become if only we made different choices. This prevents us from going deep enough anywhere to find real fulfillment. Benedict reminds us that depth requires duration, that transformation comes from commitment, not from shopping around, that you can't become wise or develop deep relationships if you're always keeping one foot out the door. His emphasis on community and shared life challenges our default individualism. We're told to focus on personal achievement, to be independent and self-sufficient, to pursue our individual dreams without letting others hold us back. But we're also desperately lonely and disconnected, suffering from what sociologists call the epidemic of isolation in modern society. Benedict understood that human beings flourish in genuine community, that we need to be known and to matter to others, that our deepest fulfillment comes from contributing to something beyond ourselves, that we become who we're meant to be through relationship rather than in isolation. His philosophy of moderation and balance addresses our tendency toward extremes, whether that's extreme work hours, extreme fitness regimens, extreme dietary restrictions, extreme political positions, or extreme wealth accumulation. We seem to have lost the capacity for middle paths, for sustainable approaches that we can maintain over decades rather than dramatic efforts we can sustain for months before burning out. Benedict's principle of discretion, of finding the moderate path appropriate to your actual circumstances and capacities, offers needed wisdom for a culture that constantly pushes toward more productivity, more consumption, more achievement, more everything. His teaching on humility speaks to our culture's promotion of shameless self-promotion and personal branding. We're told to hustle, to broadcast our achievements constantly, to craft our image carefully on social media, to network aggressively, to ensure we get credit for everything we do. This creates tremendous anxiety and inauthenticity as we manage multiple personas and obsess over how we're perceived. Benedict's humility, seeing clearly rather than self-promoting, accepting your actual capacities and limits rather than maintaining grandiose self-images, offers liberation from this exhausting performance. Benedict's communities preserved learning and culture through the collapse of Roman civilization and the chaos of the early Middle Ages. They maintained islands of stability, learning, and productivity when everything else was falling apart. They copied and preserved classical texts that would otherwise have been lost. They developed agricultural techniques and crafts. They established schools and hospitals. They showed that even amid civilizational collapse, it's possible to create communities where human flourishing continues, where culture is preserved and transmitted, where different values govern than those of the broader collapsing society. Perhaps we need similar communities now, as our own civilization faces ecological crisis, political breakdown, and the erosion of shared meaning. Places where different values are embodied, where sustainable ways of living are practiced, where wisdom traditions are preserved and transmitted. Not isolated retreats disconnected from the world's problems, but engaged communities modeling alternatives, showing that other ways of organizing human life are possible. The Benedictine legacy shaped Western civilization profoundly. The rule became the dominant form of monasticism in Western Europe for centuries. Benedictine monasteries became centers of learning, preserving classical texts and developing new knowledge in theology, philosophy, medicine, agriculture, architecture, music. They pioneered techniques that increased agricultural productivity. They established scriptoria that became the primary means of book production before printing. They created schools that educated not just monks, but also the children of nobles and eventually broader populations. Benedictine monasteries influenced political and economic structures too. Their federalized organization, multiple autonomous monasteries following the same rule and maintaining relationships, but not under centralized control, provided a model for political organization. Their emphasis on consultation and consent alongside authority influenced the development of representative institutions. Their economic practices of productive community, shared ownership, and balance between consumption and production offered alternatives to purely extractive or purely redistributive models. Today, Benedictine communities continue worldwide, maintaining the tradition Benedict established 1,500 years ago. But more importantly, his philosophical insights are being rediscovered by people outside monasteries, by those seeking sustainable rhythms of work and rest, by intentional communities trying to live more simply and collectively, by individuals looking for wisdom about commitment and transformation amid our culture of constant change. Benedict offers not rigid rules to follow mechanically, but principles for living, about balance and moderation, about community and stability, about the integration of contemplation and action, about developing character through practice rather than just thinking about virtue. These principles remain as relevant and necessary now as they were when he first articulated them, perhaps even more so given our culture's extreme imbalances and the urgency of our civilizational challenges. His example shows that individual human beings can make a difference, that one person living with integrity and wisdom can influence countless others, that ideas and practices developed in response to one historical crisis can prove valuable in very different contexts centuries later. Benedict didn't set out to influence Western civilization. He was just trying to figure out how to live well amid the collapse of his own civilization. But by focusing on fundamental questions about human flourishing and community, by developing sustainable practices rather than dramatic but unsustainable heroics, he created something that endured far beyond his own time and place. Conclusion: the ongoing journey. And so we come to the end of our exploration of Saint Benedict's philosophy. We've journeyed from his flight, from Rome's corruption, through his years in the cave, through the development of his communities at Subiaco and Monte Cassino, and the writing of his rule. We've explored his core insights about work and prayer, stability and commitment, humility and community, moderation and balance, deep reading and contemplative presence. We've seen how his philosophy emerged from direct experience rather than abstract theory, how it was tested and refined through decades of practice, how it proved sustainable and transferable in ways that more extreme approaches didn't. We've traced his influence on Western civilization, how Benedictine monasteries preserved learning and culture, how his principles shaped not just religious life, but broader social, economic, and political structures. But understanding Benedict's philosophy intellectually is just the beginning. These aren't just ideas to contemplate, they're practices to embody, principles to live. Benedict didn't write the rule as an academic exercise, but as a guide for actual transformation, for lives genuinely lived differently. The question becomes, what now? How do we take these insights and make them relevant to our actual lives in the 21st century? Most of us aren't going to join Benedictine monasteries. The specific structures of monastic life, the vows, the authority of the abbot, the detailed schedule of prayers and work, these are designed for that particular way of life. But the underlying principles can be adapted to ordinary circumstances, can inform how we structure our days and our relationships, even while living in the world. We can create rhythms in our days that balance focused work with contemplative rest, rather than oscillating between frantic activity and numbed collapse. Maybe that means setting aside time each morning for meditation or prayer before launching into work. Maybe it means taking regular breaks during the day to pause, breathe, remember your deeper purposes rather than just grinding through tasks. Maybe it means establishing an evening practice of reflection, reviewing the day with gentle attention before transitioning to rest. We can commit more deeply to the communities and relationships we're already in, rather than constantly seeking better options elsewhere. That might mean staying in a job or a city longer than feels exciting, working through difficulties in relationships rather than ending them at the first sign of conflict, showing up consistently for community responsibilities even when you don't feel like it. It means taking the vow of stability seriously, even if not formally, choosing to go deep rather than constantly sampling widely. We can practice moderation and balance rather than swinging to extremes. That might mean examining areas where you tend toward excess, whether that's work hours, consumption, exercise, political engagement, or anything else, and deliberately pulling back towards sustainable middle paths. It means resisting cultural messages that more is always better, that extremes demonstrate commitment, that moderation is mediocrity. We can work on humility, seeing ourselves clearly rather than defending inflated self-images or indulging in false modesty. That might mean getting honest about your actual strengths and limitations, accepting criticism that's accurate without being devastated, acknowledging failures and mistakes without spiraling into shame. It means developing the capacity to see yourself as you actually are, which paradoxically is both more humble and more confident than ego-driven self-presentation. We can read more deeply, engaging seriously with important texts rather than constantly consuming superficial content. That might mean choosing a few books to read slowly and repeatedly rather than racing through dozens. It means letting important ideas actually work on you, change how you see and think, rather than just collecting opinions. It means valuing transformation over information, wisdom over mere knowledge. We can create conditions in our lives where genuine growth becomes possible, where we're challenged but not crushed, where we have support but also accountability, where we're part of something larger than our individual concerns. That might mean finding or creating community that takes commitment and virtue seriously, that expects real practice, not just good intentions, that holds you accountable while also supporting your struggles. None of this is easy. Benedict's path requires genuine commitment, sustained practice over years and decades. It requires going against cultural currents that push toward individualism, consumerism, constant change, and instant gratification. It requires developing capacities for attention, for delayed gratification, for tolerating discomfort, for staying present with difficulty that our culture actively undermines. But the alternative, continuing with approaches that clearly aren't working, that leave us anxious and exhausted and lonely despite material comfort, seems worse. Benedict offers a proven path, tested across centuries and cultures, showing that human flourishing is possible through practices of balance, community, contemplation, and committed work. Not easy, not quick, not exciting in ways our culture values, but sustainable, transformative, actually leading somewhere worth going. The wisdom Benedict distilled from his decades of spiritual practice and community leadership remains as relevant and necessary today as it was 1,500 years ago. Perhaps more so, given our culture's particular imbalances and challenges. His voice speaks across the centuries, offering not easy answers or quick fixes, but a sustainable path toward genuine human flourishing, individually and collectively, spiritually and practically, in ways that serve not just ourselves, but the communities we're part of and the world we inhabit. May you find in Benedict's philosophy insights that illuminate your own journey. May you discover rhythms that sustain rather than exhaust you. May you find or create communities that challenge and support your growth. May you develop the capacity for both contemplative presence and engaged action. And may you discover that the ancient wisdom Benedict articulated continues to offer guidance for anyone seeking to live with purpose, integrity, and depth in any era. Rest well tonight, dear friend. Let these ideas settle gently into your consciousness, working at levels deeper than conscious thought. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Tomorrow, begin again. As Benedict might say, always we begin again. Each day is new, each moment an opportunity to align more fully with the life you're called to live, to embody more completely the values you recognize as true. Good night. Sleep very, very well. Until we meet again in this quiet place, where ancient wisdom meets contemporary seeking, where timeless truths illuminate present struggles, where the path forward is found by attending to voices from the past who grappled with questions that remained forever relevant. Rest now. Everything is well. Sleep peacefully. Dream deeply. Good night.